Joan, Frank, please, thank you so much.
Roshi, you want to start us out? Did we lose Roshi?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay,
can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Yeah. Great. You know, I wish that I could show you where I am right now. I'm on in my hermitage in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains up at 9,400 feet. And this is being done through satellite. So my signal from my little hermitage travels 37,000 miles up to some satellite out there in space and travels down into Annie's world. And so we can't guarantee stability of signal, but we can't guarantee stability of anything. And so if the sound is funny or the visual is funny, please just be patient and Frank will take over from me. So I want to thank you so much for inviting Frank and me to this. I will say that I'm holding a lot of unprocessed grief myself. You know, I don't stand outside of grief like a grief professional. I'm in the river of sorrow along with millions of people who are present on the planet today. And I'm studying my own experience as well as bearing witness to the experience of many, many people. I know Frank is in the same situation. You know, it's not only grief about the lives that have been lost, but also I'm feeling deep about the loss of justice in our world, or the more visible biases, whether it's in Central Park calling 911 to accuse a bird watcher of stalking her, or whether it's a man in Minneapolis whose neck is pressed to the ground by the knee of a policeman and then who dies. We are in an extraordinarily vulnerable time. We have always been in a vulnerable time, but it is more visible to us, I believe, than I have ever experienced in my 77, soon to be 78 years on this planet. And I feel that it is important for us at this time to not only acknowledge grief, instead of burying it in addiction or denial of other kinds, but actually work with it as skillfully as possible. And to this end, I'd like to just do a screen share, if I can, of a few images on a PowerPoint, and I'm going to screen share right now, and I hope I do this right. I never know. Did that image come through?
No.
Okay. Let's see. So share screen. Okay, I got it. Share. Now, how's that?
It's great. We can see your screen now.
Okay, you're seeing more of my screen, and let me just get up here. So I just want to share a few slides to begin with. I was asked by Pepsi-Cola Company to do a program for their employees on grief and loss. And so I put together some of my thoughts on grief and loss. And then as the days passed after that, work with the Pepsi company employees. By the way, I thought it was very cool of Pepsi to ask me to do this. I was grateful because many of their workers, particularly the so-called essential workers in the bottling companies, where it's not automated, had to go back to work in their institutional community. So I didn't have this slide at the time, but I added it to the deck, and it says, "Grief holds her covered face against the shoulders of history and weeps in mourning." And this is at the Peace Monument in front of the US Capitol in Washington. And I feel like this image really exemplifies the spirit that many of us are enveloped by at this time, that the conscious and unconscious biases, not only toward people of color, but toward dying people, toward our earth, toward those who care for others, is actually invoking in us a kind of grief that is essential for us to face. And in this regard, the storyteller, Terry Tempest Williams, wrote, "A good friend of mine said, 'You're married to sorrow.' And I looked at him and said, 'I'm not married to sorrow. I just choose not to look away.'" And I think some of you have seen this image. This is of an ER nurse in a fairly small hospital who was with a patient who was facing imminent death from the coronavirus. And the nurse wrote, as the nurse was being asked to leave to take care of somebody else, but with a less drastic situation. And the nurse wrote, "Just going to hold his hand for a bit. I don't think he has long." So I feel like we're here with each other doing this. We're just here holding each other's hand for a bit, because really in one way or another, we don't have that much longer. And I think for me, the question is, even though maybe I have 10 years or 20 or who knows, or 10 hours, I don't know, or you, I don't know. But how do we awaken in these conditions? So I'm going to move out of this share for a little bit and go back to just talking to you all. We are facing some really extraordinary circumstances. The word unprecedented has been used by so many. It's not only this pandemic, which has caused an enormous global death toll, but also there's the economic catastrophe that we're facing with the concomitant lockdowns and job losses triggering maybe the most significant financial crisis since the Depression, and shocks that are social in nature and as well cultural in nature that we're only just beginning to understand. But I think that really the biggest crisis that we're facing is a crisis of the heart and of the mind. And it goes right to the core of how we live as social beings, of how we deal with fear and how we deal with loss. and also, as Frank knows well, how we die. We've lost so much. We've lost our daily structure. Many of us have lost the sense of really being in contact with our communities, except through our digital connection. Many people have lost their entire savings in their homes. And what's happening right now is also revealing serious issues that have been there forever, but they're issues of inequality that are related to race and to poverty. And in a way, there's a loss of innocence with this, a loss of blindness. And I think it takes enormous courage, but it also takes a lot of care and connection to face the magnitude of losses that we're experiencing today, like not being able to attend funerals, or my assistant, Noah, and his beloved Nicole were to be married in October. And now they've put off the wedding. Today, I did a commencement address online. The graduates could not gather in a physical space, and so it was a virtual commencement. We've also lost the sense of autonomy, of certainty, of predictability, and of any sense of normalcy. But it's curious, though, this is also beginning to feel normal, what we're going through. And in a way, that is a problem. Yes, grief is normal, but when it falls out of awareness into a sense of normalcy, and we lose the connection of the power of grief, of the vividness of grief, it's something for us to actually bring into focus. I think we're also facing the loss of a way of life. And as I said, we have an idea of what might happen down the road. It might be next week, who knows? All the lockdowns are lifted. We don't know what's going to happen. But many of us have a sense that we're not going to be returning to so-called normal after this outbreak is ended. And there are these breakdowns in our climate, in our economies, ecosystems, that are losses that are just in the early stages. And these losses, I believe, are cumulative, or have a cumulative effect in terms of our experience. We are, in a way, experiencing, and we see it in polarization in what's happening in the world today, like just what's happening in our paramilitary police forces in many of our cities. We're experiencing not only grief at scale, but also fear at scale. And this is complicated by the experience of physical distancing, and for many of us of isolation. And we have not talked about, for example, the loss of safety, where a family system, a household, is not necessarily always a safe place for a child. So the loss of safety as well as a result of physical distancing. And I think it's pretty wild to consider that something around 2.6 billion people today in the world are under lockdown. And that's more people than were alive in World War II. And our governments have told us to basically reduce our lives to the smallest social element, the household. And when we're outside of our homes, we have to be 6 feet apart. So people are inventing these crazy devices that make it possible to even recognize we're, at a safe physical distance from each other. And and one piece I read described it as we're like magnets with reverse polarities, with sliding off the sidewalks or around cars, anything to avoid being close to each other. Yeah. And this in the face that we are social animals. And our evolution has been built on our ability to communicate and to cooperate, not just through words, but also through how we are able to read each other's body language, and through physical contact, and also through the experience of intimacy. Even as our interconnection has become more tangible than ever before, some of us have come to actually fear connection, fear contact. We look at a single touch, or a piece of money, or a grocery bag, or a credit card terminal. These put us in touch with so many people who are unseen. And are these people okay? We ask ourselves. And I feel that we've begun to see that grief and fear are deeply intertwined. I think of the first Buddhist nuns. Many of them entered into practice through the experience of grief, the loss of a baby or of a child, being subjected to violence, being degraded by their social status. I think of the Buddhist nuns who gathered around the Buddha after he died, and whose tears fell on the body of the Buddha. And though, some sectors said, oh, that was unclean, others, Ananda in particular, acknowledged the power of the Buddha's contemporaries, women contemporaries, in grieving his death. And yet, our society struggles with grief, and it also struggles with fear. And both are something that many feel they should be ashamed of, or grief and fear should be hidden away, or should be processed as quickly as possible. And one of the things that is really up for me as a recovering anthropologist is the absence of the myths, the stories, the rituals, and the practices that actually create a context of safety and meaning and connection. This is something that is not inconsequential. I think of the families. Adriana just told the story of a colleague of hers whose mother died in Mexico and not being able to go to the funeral. And I know Frank and I have spoken and heard from so many people who have not been able to fully acknowledge or be in the embrace of community in the presence of death. And I think back to the slide that I showed earlier. I just want to hold his hand. He hasn't much longer to go. Yes, we're in a very powerful time. The loss of certainty, of autonomy, the loss of social connection, the loss of our access to each other. One of my students said to me after a teaching that Frank and I did through Upaya, and she said, you know, somebody said to me recently, and this is a chaplain, and you know, one of our core chaplain people, Marilyn, she said, she works in the cancer center as a chaplain. And she said, grief is love that has nowhere to go. Grief is love that has nowhere to go. And we can try to understand or bring into focus fear, because fear is this experience that's a response to real or imagined threat. And we are certainly in the grip of fear at this time. So there's some perspectives that might help us navigate this time of loss, of fear, and of grief. I think it's important for us to realize that grief and fear have gifts to offer us, hard as it may be to see them when we're in the thick of the experience. For example, both grief and fear are profoundly humanizing. Both can actually deepen our empathy and our capacity for compassion and insight. And of course, allowing ourselves into the experience can open the doors of empathy in a very particular way. So I'd like to take just a few moments, just have a breath. And I'd like to share just some practice with you, if that's okay. Is that okay, Adriana and Frank and Annie? Just a simple reflective practice.
Perfect.
I'm going to ask us to take a moment right now on the in-breath to bring our attention to our in-breath. And reflect on the perspective that I shared earlier, that grief is love that has nowhere to go. I know that when I grieve, the grief is really rising from love. And then let's just take a few moments to reflect on these phrases. May I be open to the pain of grief. May I be open to the pain of grief. May loving kindness sustain me. May loving kindness sustain me. May I find strength that I may use my resources to serve others. May I find strength that I may use whatever resources I have to serve others. May I be open to receive love and compassion from others. May I be open to receive love and compassion from others. And just letting the sense of those phrases settle into your heart. And I just want to finish this short reflection, returning to Terry Tempest Williams. There is deep beauty, she wrote, in not averting our gaze. No matter how hard it is, no matter how heartbreaking it can be. It is about presence. It is about bearing witness. And then she says, I used to think bearing witness was a passive act. I don't believe that anymore. I think that when we are present, when we bear witness, and we do not divert our gaze, something is revealed. The very marrow of life. A transformation occurs. Consciousness shifts. And may that transformation, say I, be available to all of us who are gathered here, thanks to Annie and Adriana. And Frank, I know you have borne witness to, and also that you have accompanied so many through grief. I hope you can now share a little of your wisdom.
Thank you, Roshi. I don't know that I have so much wisdom, but I have a lot of heart opened today. You know, I was so happy that Annie started us off with silence. It seems the right place to begin to explore grief. This morning I came across the words of Howard Thurman, you know, in his famous speech at Spelman College. And he said something beautiful that I loved. He said, "There is something in every one of you that waits, listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself." He said, don't be deceived or thrown off by the noises, even those that are in your dreams, your ambitions, so that you don't hear the sound of what's genuine in you. He said, because it's the only true guide you will ever have. And he said, you know, you're the only you that's ever lived in all of existence. And if you can't hear the sound of what's genuine in you, you will spend your days at the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. He said, so it doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a lawyer or a housewife. He said, I'm secure because I can become quiet enough, still enough to hear the sound of what's genuine in myself. That feels like a really good place for us to start. Because, you know, like you are helping us to see, Roshi, I think to live fully, to meet grief honestly, we have to learn to inhabit silence and aloneness. That's what's going to introduce us to humility and vulnerability, which to me have been the gateways to the intimacy of not knowing. Roshi knows that I recently suffered a series of strokes, and with that has come a tremendous sense of vulnerability. And I don't experience vulnerability as weakness. Like grief, it's a kind of underground stream. It's running through all our lives. And if we try to get rid of our vulnerability, it's a kind of conceit that cuts us off from our hearts, actually, and makes it really difficult for us to be with other people's grief. So the only choice that we really have, is to inhabit our vulnerability and to find some compassionate way to be intimate with our own eventual disappearance and the loss of those that we love. And to discover perhaps some way of connecting with an open, loving awareness that can embrace everything that we find agreeable and disagreeable in this life. So for me, in grieving, it's about meeting myself over and over again. And that enables me to meet other people, you know, my next door neighbor and those who are suffering around the world. What seems to me right now, and I think it's true in this webinar, is that people want to be real with each other. You know, we need to be real with one another now, maybe more than ever. How do we help people who are grieving or suffering? I think first we have to understand that living well is not about eradicating our wounds and our weaknesses, but understanding how they complete our identity. They equip us to help others. So this is the homework we have to do, all of us have to do. to become really familiar, really intimate with our ongoing experience of loss and grief, to be lovingly aware of what happens for us in these bodies of ours, in these hearts of ours, in our minds. That's what enables us to heal. And it's what enables us to build an empathetic bridge to other people. That's what allows us to touch their loss and their grief with love instead of with fear and pity. That's the only way we can be a trustworthy refuge for ourselves or each other. My own wounds, my own sufferings, the things that I'm most embarrassed about or ashamed about, often that they've been the thing that have enabled me to feel my way into the lives of others, to be with their suffering. And without my own suffering, I don't think I could understand or build a bridge to theirs. So we need this really sincere, deep exploration. And we need to learn how to hold paradox and complexity, that grace and grit are partners. If we say to someone else who's afraid or grieving that I understand, and we haven't really looked at our own fear, at our own grief, they will sniff out our insincerity and our sentimentality, and they'll yell bullshit. And we won't be a reliable refuge for them. We have to do our homework. Second, I think we have to see that grief's not a pathology. Grief is a way we love. Like Roshi just reminded us, grief is this love that has no place to go. So let's get intimate with it. So many ways that grief is showing itself, loss is showing itself these days. Roshi helped us to see them, and like I was with a student of mine in Italy, and both her parents died from COVID, both her parents. And she couldn't go and see them during their illness. And the army takes away their bodies to a general burial ground. And so she couldn't have any kind of memorial for them, because she too was infected with the virus. I think another thing that really helps us to be with our own grief and the grief of others is to see that it challenges our notions of control, cracks this defensive shell that we walk around with, and it exposes the ways that we try and hide from our human frailty. I don't know, for me also, I think it involves letting go of all of our models of brief recovery, There's so many theories about how we're going to get through our grief, And I think it's good to know something about the territory, but sometimes we confuse the map with the real thing. And our fear of lack of control, it leads us to try to manage other people's grief. When we speak about getting over our grief, how come we never talk about getting over our joy or getting over our happiness? Grief is part of the human condition, right? And our relationship to it, of course, it changes over time. It doesn't always have the same intensity. But if we try to avoid it, it's dangerous for us. We have so many habits in our culture and in all our subcultures about managing grief, and they're generally driven by fear and impatience. So let's not hurry other people through their grief, and let's allow the whole spectrum of expressions of grief, from absolute numbness, where we feel like we're walking through molasses and we don't know whether we should turn left or right at the end of our driveway. And let's allow for the wild expressions of grief, the out of control expressions that are rarely allowed in bereavement groups, Let's know that grief has lots of faces. But sadness is only one of the faces. Maybe it's more useful to think of grief as a whole constellation of experiences that include sadness, of course, but also fear and blame and shame and anger. That's a really important expression of grief that a lot of us are feeling now. And we're not really prepared for it, for the intensity of feelings that emerge when someone we love dies or we experience some kind of loss. I think it's important to recognize that our grief is not just about what we've had in loss, but sometimes about what we never got to have. And that's happening for a lot of us now. And it's triggering the everyday grief of our life, the pools of grief that we've been carrying around sometimes for years. Grief is, we think of grief as some response to some singular event, like the loss of our mother. But we've been living with grief our whole lives. But our tendency to self-protection, it leads us to store those experiences in some cramped corner of our minds and hearts and bodies. And then when we experience something like the pandemic, it gives rise to that intense grief and we feel it all over again. I don't trust models. But I've seen a really simple way of talking about grief that I want to share with you. And please don't take this as a literal model, but it's what I've seen in being with, I don't know, thousands of people now who have died and their families. And the first of those is just the feeling of loss. And it feels like you've been punched in the belly. And it takes your breath away. And we don't know what to do. We're really confused, And it feels like shock and grief, like you can't believe it. And we get swept away by guilt or remorse in some way. And then we judge ourselves mercilessly, I should have taken him to the hospital sooner. I should have noticed this was occurring. It never ceases to amaze me how our capacity to be cruel to ourselves when we most need our mercy, If we could just stop sometimes and for a moment and listen to the sound of our voice when we're being so critical and judgmental about ourselves, I think our hearts would open to embrace that pain. And then there's this experience of losing rather, that happens for months and years sometimes. When someone we love dies, we don't just lose them once. If our wife was the one that did the business at the bank, whenever we go into the bank, we lose her again. If our partner was the one that kept the bed warm, when we climb into bed and we feel the cold sheets at night, we lose them again. It's not a single experience. We feel more fragile in this time. When someone we love dies, particularly when it's a parent, they've been there for us as a kind of buffer standing between us and death, and now we feel our own mortality. And it's in this period of losing that goes on, that keeps happening, that we feel most alone. Friends drop away, and they're tired of our grief. I know one of my students whose husband died suddenly. After some months, her friends started talking to her and saying to her that she should get a dog as a companion, Or others tell us we should keep busy, get new, something else we should learn to do, Advice doesn't help. What helps is to listen genuinely, to listen in a devout way that helps to bring out the truth from the other person. We have to tell our stories many times when we felt the loss, 10,000 times. Sometimes we need a story more than we need food. And when we listen, to emphasize the positive without cliches. When we're looking back over our life, we tend to look back critically. So emphasize the positive. But don't be afraid of allowing the pain that needs to be expressed to show itself. We say that time heals grief, but that's not true. That's a cliche. Time doesn't heal grief. Time and loving attention heal grief. It's the willingness to bring our loving attention, to our experience, to investigate the pain, to touch it with compassion that heals. Then there's this not final, but this third way that grief shows itself as a kind of loosening. So there's loss and there's losing, and then there's loosening. And that's the period where the knot of grief that starts to get untied, it doesn't have you by the throat anymore. And it's not a return to life as it was before. There's no way going to go back. You don't go back to some kind of normal, no more than we're going to go back to normal at the end of this virus. You can't go back. We're a different person. We've been reconstituted by loss. But in this period of loosening, the emotions subside some, We begin to understand that even when someone dies, our relationship with them continues. So these are just a way of holding, of beginning to see what happens in this process of grieving. It's not a pathology. It's how we love. It's how we love. Oh, I don't want to go on and keep talking. I want to hear from you, actually. And so, Annie and Adriana, maybe you could tell people how to raise their hands and how to put notes in the chat, and then we can listen and hear from others. And Roshi and I can try and do our best to respond, okay?
Sure. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you so much, Roshi, Joan. Annie, we are going to open the floor to questions in two ways. Some questions are going to be taken not in voice here in the screen, and some others are going to be read in the chat box. So Annie, do you want to tell people exactly what we expect for this? No, not what we expect, what we suggest for questions.
How do we do it?
Yes. So, so please put, if you have a question, please, you can put it in the chat. And then we will take one from the chat, and then we'll invite people to unmute and ask a question verbally, vocally. And then we'll go back to the chat and we'll go back and forth like that. We have about 30 minutes-ish. So, so we will take as many questions as we can in that time, which may not be that many. And one thing to keep in mind is to please ask your question from the heart. So something personal to you, as opposed to being just a theoretical question. So I think,
how do they raise their hands, Annie?
Oh, sorry. Yes. And how you can raise your hand if you want to ask a vocal question, you can go to the bottom of your screen and choose raise hand. Can everybody see that? I have the host screen.
It's under participants.
Okay,
under
so thank you. Under participants, you can raise your hand. I don't have that option.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we'll start. We do have some questions here. I guess I'll just start. Well, let me just throw one out for you all. Lots of thank yous, but let's see. I'll give you a few and then you all can choose. How about that?
Oh, just choose one.
Just one? Okay.
Yeah.
So the first question we got was from Jules, who asked, does grieving need healing?
Well, I'll start here. I'll just say grieving is healing. The experience of loss is, you feel like fragmented, like you've been split apart, blown into 1,000 pieces. And what the process of grieving is a way of rediscovering a kind of wholeness that was already there. It isn't about a puzzle where you're putting back all the pieces, but you rediscover your innate wholeness, I would say. So I'd say grieving is healing. Yeah. Yeah. But it's not something we fix. It's not something we get over. My experience is that my grief lasts a lifetime. It's just part of the human condition. And it's both, it's what connects me to myself and to others. Yeah. Should we take another question, Annie?
Sure. Yeah. Do you want to take a question from somebody verbally? Let's see. We have a few hand raised.
Yes.
Okay.
It looks like the first one is Augusta.
Yes.
So yeah. So why don't I'll unmute you, Augusta, and then you can ask your question.
I got it. Thank you. Annie and I were both unmuting us, so it was going back and forth. Thank you so much, Annie. Thank you, Adriana. Thank you so much, Roshi, Joan, and Frank. I could spend the whole time saying thank you, so I'm gonna stop. This is a question for you specifically, Roshi, Joan. But Frank, if you have something to add, I'd love to hear that as well. Roshi, Joan, I recorded you as having said, who knows what you actually said, but I heard, in this experience of grief, we can start to experience it as normal, and there's a problem in that. And I want to give a little more context for my question then here, if you could talk about that a little bit more. In the beginning of the sheltering in place, I found myself in a conversation with my father, I'm in San Francisco, he's back in Philadelphia, and he's in his mid-70s now. And I said, I'm acclimating to the sheltering in place. It's becoming more comfortable. And he said, no, you just think you're acclimating. And there wasn't enough context to kind of unpack that with him, but I've been sitting with that and it's been percolating in me, and what you've said, maybe it's connected to that. And I still don't really think I understand it, because part of me feels like being able to navigate these times is a part of how I survive it and thrive in it. And I can also see how kind of succumbing to it and accepting it can have a negative impact, but I haven't digested it all. I'd love to hear your wisdom.
So you just gave the answer. That's just, I feel that very much captures what I was trying to say. It's like, for example, I spoke earlier about racism. We have normalized, not everyone, but to a very great extent, violence toward women, violence toward people of color, the ignoring of poverty, walking past the unsheltered as if they're invisible. So that's a normalization of suffering that actually leads to more suffering, because it's what I've called moral apathy, that there's a kind of bubble that is produced by the society that we're part of, the culture we're part of, the community we're part of, by a kind of shared agreement that is not articulated but understood, which is to turn away, what Terry Tempest Williams was saying, to turn away from. And I myself, in my practice, I want to stay sensitive to harm. I want to stay sensitive to the truth of suffering. I don't want to normalize it. I don't want to normalize suffering, racism, delusion, greed, hatred, destruction of the earth. No. And I want to also to develop the capacity to actually be in the charnel grounds of suffering, and not myself be consumed and destroyed, but actually to learn from, to deepen, to develop moral character as a result of that.
Okay, Annie, that's beautiful response, Roshi.
We have another question in the chat that I think is really a good one. Could the speakers talk about preparing for possible loss, seeing our loved ones ill during this time when we have so limited access to them? My mother is in the hospital and I miss her and long to see her. That's from Melanie.
Oh boy. I just say that, you know, the way we prepare for loss is to love the people in our lives as fully and completely as we possibly can. Love is just as hard as you can. That's what I say. Just love as hard as you can. And in the situation that Melanie's describing, her mom's in the hospital, she can't be with her. It's really hard these days. I mean, you know, people are trying to stay in contact by phone or other kinds of digital devices, but they can't. And so you just have to go deep inside. You got to go deep inside and find your mom there, because you might not be able to see her. And I wish I could say that there's a fix for that. But you might just need to go deep inside and really hold her close and speak internally to her about your love for her. And remember her love for you, however way it took shape in your life. Yeah. All of us have been loved in some way, maybe not enough, or we wanted to be loved more fully, but without love, we'd be pathological. So we've all been loved in some way. So that's the only context that can hold this kind of fear and loss. Yeah. Yeah. You know, my mother's been dead for 50 years, but we're still carrying on our relationship with each other. And we're still working things out, you know. And that's the way that I love her, even though she's died. So call her if you can, see her on some digital device if you can, but hold her close in your heart. Yeah. Okay, let's go to another one.
Perfect. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Joan. Next, we can unmute Jiankui, Jiankui Chuang, and I'm gonna unmute you, Jiankui, or you can unmute yourself.
Wow, lucky me. I just started to type my question in the box. So, oh my gosh, dear teachers and dear Sangha, I'm so just really honored to be here. Thank you. Thank you. My question is about fatigue, that I hear about compassion and empathy fatigue. And I've been thinking that perhaps it's a misnomer for grasping fatigue. And I say that in my direct experience when I'm also work as a clinical psychologist, and when I'm with somebody where afterwards I could feel my face tightening and at the end exhausted, I realize it's about because I really want something for them that they can't have right now. And I am so wanting that, and I can't get what I want from them. It's this, and it's that's the fatigue. And yet I hear people talk about this empathy fatigue and compassion fatigue. And I think it's not so much that, because I think empathy and compassion allows me to connect. And that is so enlivening. And so, like you said, it's love. And so if you could clarify that, and I know it does take, I would love to hear how you develop too, right? Everyone's different, how we develop this capacity, that it becomes enlivening. It's about living. It's not this sort of collapse and deadening and numbing. And how do we do that for you?
Okay, where's your backpack? You can close the door.
Okay, Roshi, why don't you start with that one?
So it's such a great question. And I think one of the things that is interesting is to understand the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy is this experience of being physically or emotionally or cognitively deeply attuned to another. So you're in resonance with that experience that the person is going through physically or emotionally or affectively. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to change the experience or enhance or benefit the person that you're in an empathic relationship with. But you're in this resonance, it's vicarious. And so I wrote in my book, Standing at the Edge, a world without empathy is a world where we're dead to each other. Empathy is really important. It has to do with the expansion of our subjectivity to a point where, you know, we're really, we've actualized interbeing. We're not separate from any being or thing. But just, you know, when your client is sitting across from you, just start with one, if you will. It's not just in your head. You're experiencing that person's physical presence through your body and so forth. But when there's over-identification, we can experience distress. And so we learn through practice, in part being in resonance, but in part being able to distinguish self from other. That's, you know, that person is sitting with somebody who's just, you know, brokenhearted. I feel all of my heartbreak, and I also am in this emotional resonance with the person. But I can also say to myself, I recognize I'm not that person. It's almost like an invasion to say, I really know what you're feeling, or I'm experiencing what you're feeling. So that capacity to make that distinction is important. Compassion, though, is a little bit different.
Oh, do we lose Roshi?
I don't hear her. I wonder if we did.
I think we lost you, Roshi. I don't know if you can hear us. Her Wi-Fi may have gone out.
Yeah, she looks frozen.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can finish what she was saying. I'll just be the, you know, spokes. But what she's talking about here is compassion is really different. It's the deep wish to relieve suffering of the other person, of course. And that's the natural movement that arises out of empathy. But where we have to be really careful there is that sometimes we can't alleviate the suffering. We just can't. And there, I think it's really important to recognize that compassion gives us the ability to stay with the suffering, to stay with the suffering in our relationship to it until our defenses against the suffering fall down. And then we can really see what the true causes of the suffering are. We can intervene. If we don't do that, what starts to happen is we mistake a compassionate action for trying to relieve our personal distress. You know, the fact that we want to do something and we can't, there's nothing to do, or we can't do something, or we keep doing more things like giving more chemotherapy or some treatment that's futile. And then that's not a compassionate act. That's just an act of trying to alleviate our own personal distress. The other thing I want to just add to what you were saying, because you said you're exhausted. And I think it's really important to look at that, you know, to see. Of course, there's lots of conditions that cause us to be exhausted. You know, the systems we work in, unrealistic expectations of, you know, those systems or families. You know, there's the accumulated fatigue from just doing too much, you know. But also there's the exhaustion that comes from not doing too much, but just not doing it with wholeheartedness. And or the effort to defend ourselves against the uncertainty. That's exhausting, you know. So to get really familiar with the state of exhaustion is important to me. Well, how do I know it in my body? How do I know it in my heart? How do I know it in my mind? You know, in the work that you do and that so many of us do, it's not enough. Our normal coping strategies aren't sufficient. We can't just come home and have a glass of wine and watch TV, you know. Just like right now in this pandemic, our normal coping strategies are insufficient. We need ways of metabolizing what we're experiencing, integrating what we're experiencing. That's what enables us to continue without being fried. So we could talk about this for days, but compassion doesn't fatigue. Yeah. Egoic effort fatigues. Yeah. All right, let's go. Let's. I hope that's of some small help, and let's go to someone else, and hopefully Roshi can join us. Annie?
Sure. Yes.
I'm
we have
here.
Oh,
Oh,
you're
you're
back.
there?
I'm back.
Oh, good.
Oh,
Good.
there you are. Do you want to
I,
finish your? Go ahead and finish
I,
what you were
fin- I
saying.
finished.
Finished.
I finished for you.
Finished.
Yeah.
You did great. You did A
Thank you.
plus, Frank.
Thank you, love. Thank you, love. Okay, let's go
Okay.
to someone else, Annie.
Okay, so we have someone whose name is SF. That's the only name we have. Question: how does the death of a person relate to our own delusion or ignorance of interbeing / interconnectedness? A person dying isn't really lost, so grief and loss from this is from our misperception / delusion, from our thinking habit of separateness, question mark. Thus, feeling grief and feeling of loss for a person dying is a sign of delusion and need for adjusting our perception / perspective, question mark.
I don't know.
That's too many questions for me. It's too late in the afternoon.
You know, yeah, we could say it's a delusion. You know, like one great teacher I know said, it is a delusion. Of course it's a delusion. And, you know, the death of a child is one of the most painful delusions. And the only right thing to do is to grieve it. Yeah. So, you know, I think the way we work our way through delusion is being as real as we possibly can with our experience. And that means not to cut myself off from anything, any feeling, any experience in my life. You know, I can't be liberated, I can't be free if I'm rejecting any part of myself, including my delusions. And so, you know, I have a invitation that says, welcome everything, push away nothing. And it doesn't mean we have to like everything that comes or agree with everything that comes. It just means we have to be willing to meet it. You know, we have to, it's at our doorstep. What does it have to teach us? Yeah. Okay, Annie, let's keep going.
Thank you. Roshi, did you want to add anything to that?
You know, I remember our mutual friend, Ron Dawson, whom we love so much, Frank and I. And, you know, he would emphasize loving awareness. And I think, Frank, you really captured that. You know, it's not a matter of relating just to emptiness. I felt in working with grieving people for so many years that grief is deeply humanizing, that there are such extraordinary gifts that are realized through allowing us to have our hearts cracked open. And so, you know, yeah, from the point of view of the absolute, and all is one, and, you know, so on and so forth, you know, okay, but also I do not want to lose the gift of grief. And I just say this because I remember when my mother died, you know, there was a kind of moment where I had a Buddhist thought, so to speak. And I immediately went, no, this is the person who gave birth to me. There's only one of these. They're hard to come by. She just left her body, and I need to explore her absence in my life, and also to let all of the love and appreciation, which I never expressed fully to her, to come forth in the experience of grief. I'm so glad I did not turn away.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hot fire grief, you know, maybe one of the hottest we ever encountered, the death of someone we love. And it just penetrates the tough, calcified layers of our minds and hearts, you know, and plunges us sometimes into these powerful experiences of fear and despair and sadness. And we can get consumed with resistance. But, you know, in my experience, you know, I don't know anything that's, as Roshi said, has humanized me more, has made me more fully human than to not turn away. Yeah. The healing is always found by going toward the suffering. And I don't want to do any kind of bypass around it. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How,
You know, I don't
how-
think the Buddha turned away from grief either.
Yeah, me either.
But anyway,
You know, Roshi mentioned our friend Ramdas. We both were there to speak at his memorial, and I said, I feel him everywhere. I'm not apart from him in a way. You know, I just feel his incredible spacious being, and yet, I miss my friend. I miss our banter at the breakfast table, and I miss, you know, our laughter and our teasing each other, and our love, our loving moments with each other. All of that's true. He's with me everywhere, and I miss my friend. And I can hold that paradox. Grief's taught me how to do that. Okay, Annie. I don't know how we are in time, Annie. I've lost track, but
We have
well,
7 minutes left, and I think we can take 1 or 2 more questions. Is that okay for you both?
sure, Antonio, please.
And I'm gonna call now.
Adriana.
Yes, don't worry.
Sorry.
No, don't worry. I'm gonna call now Debbie, and I'm gonna unmute Debbie, and she can ask her question. She's unmute now.
Thank you so much for your words today. They've really meant a lot to me and resonated a lot with me. I lost my father a month ago to suicide. And you spoke about the guilt, and I feel that a lot. And I wonder if you can speak a bit to, you know, I spend a lot of, you know, I go up and down with how I feel, and often it's just plain sadness about him being gone, and then often feeling that he's here with me, but then also the feelings about how he died and the guilt, my guilt attached to that, and trying to process that. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about how to deal with those two things at the same time. Thank you.
Oh, Debbie. Oh, Debbie. Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. And like, it's so evident in you. Your love for your dad is so evident in you. You know, it's hard. We've got so many ideas, so many cultural biases against people taking their own life that it's hard for us to see sometimes how it's motivated by fear. And sometimes it's people's best strategy, you know? What's important here is not so much the way he died, but that he has died. And to really be with that as best you can, you know? Sounds like you're with the whole spectrum of it, you know? Some days you feel guilty, and some days you feel sad, and some days probably you're just, you know, full up of love for him, you know? That's how it is. It's all of these things, you know? This isn't on you. This was his choice. And what's on you is how you let it inhabit your life and how you meet it, yeah? And the best you can do is really have a dialogue with him. You know, put a photo of him on your altar, on your mantelpiece, and talk to him every day. I mean, every day. You just go by and say, Dad, and you tell him about your day, and this is what's been going on in your day, and you say, Dad, you know, this is the part I don't understand about what you did. And I want to understand. And maybe I'll never be able to understand, but I want to. And so you talk to him every day, Debbie. That's what you do. And you know, slowly but surely, you begin to hear something, you know, that in your own heart, you know, and It's not like some ghost speaking to you, but you begin to hear something from your deep relationship with him that helps guide you. That's how it's been for me with my mother, who went through had a similar action, you know. Took me a long time to forgive her and to understand how much fear she had in her, running through her veins. Yeah. Thank you for your courage and your willingness to share it with us, because this is actually how the injustice and the taboos get finally broken. By people like you having the courage to speak directly and honestly. And you don't have to have it all together. None of us do. Thank you, Debbie. Is there anything else you want to add, Debbie?
No, just thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. You be kind to yourself now, Debbie. It's really important that you're really kind. The tendency is going to be to want to judge, you know, or to second guess yourself. But now you need kindness. Nothing is more important now. And you can do it. Your innate, compassionate heart will be a reliable guide. You can trust it. It won't let you down. Okay? Okay.
Roshi, do you want
Debbie,
to say
thank
anything?
you.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry.
No words, just heart. Just thank you for reaching through your sorrow and touching all of us. You know, I know we're coming to the end of our time together, and I just, Annie and Adriana and community, I want to thank you so much for providing this opportunity to sit with each other in a time that is in a time that it's hard to give words to. And I'd like to conclude my part with some words written by the poet Wendell Berry. Really amazing. Once a tobacco farmer, always a poet. And outside of his house, there's an old sycamore tree. And he wrote about this sycamore tree. And he wrote, fences have been tied to it, nails driven into it, hacks and whittles cut in it. The lightning has burned it. There is no year it has flourished in that has not harmed it. It has risen to a strange perfection in the warp and bending of its long growth. It has gathered all accidents into its purpose. It has become the intention and radiance of its dark fate. Wendell's words really touched me when I read them years ago. And it is for me about pointing to what Frank and I have spoken to earlier. It's not to make a false gift, a fake currency of what we're going through. at this time. But it's to allow ourselves to be ripened and to let our roots grow deeper in a soil that feels absent of nurturing. But actually, there is nurturing in that darkness. So I thank you, Frank. I love being with you. I'm so grateful that we will be together again teaching in August, and that also you'll be teaching at Upaya before then on this very subject of grief, and that Annie and Adriana and your community allowed us to share some of our experience of what we've learned from others, but also from our own lives and all that we have learned from loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshi. Thank you, Frank. This has been so beautiful. I'm going to go back and listen to the whole thing at least one more time. So rich. And the thank yous are coming into the chat. I hope you can see them there. And I wanted to just make a suggestion for people who want to support the work that you're doing to go to upaya.org. It's just upaya.org. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah, upaya.org, upaya.org. And you can give a donation there, or you can sign up for a class, or however you'd like. And Frank, what is your website if people want to follow up and get your book and things like that?
It's the 5invitations.com, 5invitations.com. They can go there. There's lots of resources, or they can also go to the METTA, M-E-T-T-A Institute, my organization. Either of those. 5 Invitations has a lot of resources and videos and things that might be helpful.
Awesome, thank you. And this, we will be having another webinar next week, which is kind of unusual. Usually it's monthly. And next week's a little different, but also might be interesting for some of you. It's on intentional giving. So it's how to use whatever resources you have to change the world, and not just to continue the world as it is, but to make systemic change with whatever material resources you have. So I hope people will join. Yes, Adriana?
Yes, I'm just gonna tell people that it's on June 3rd, and we are going back to our normal time, which is 7 p.m. Eastern time.
Hey guys, can I say just one more thing? And that is that Upaya is a jewel on the planet. It is a precious jewel, and it is undergoing unbelievable difficulty right now. And so if you can support it, if you have a way that you can give even a small gift, whatever is appropriate, whatever your means will allow, to please support Upaya. I teach there quite often with Roshi, and it is a precious jewel in our world. And not just about Buddhist Dharma practice, but about social action. And so please, please, I come to you in my begging bowl and ask you to please, please be generous with the Upaya Zen Center. Thank you very much for letting me say that. Yeah.
And I would totally second that, third that. Yes, yes, and yes. I've been there many times. It is a refuge and a beautiful place of very special Zen social justice teachings, and led by a beautiful person. And I will finish with the bell as soon as Adriana, if she has something else, and then I'll invite a sound of the bell for us to be finished.
Okay.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to say thank you again. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Roshi. This has been wonderful, healing, and we have no words to thank you enough. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate you being here, because without you, we can't continue with this movement that we love so much. Thank you. Thank you, Annie.
So dear friends, we'll finish with a bell. So from this time we've had together and shared together, may all of us on this call and all beings everywhere live with ease and joy and freedom, and may all beings everywhere be free from suffering and the root causes of suffering. Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful rest of your evening and be well and safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana and Annie, for organizing this.